So let's go. Unlike the laws of physics, which are free of inconsistencies, every man-made order is packed with internal contradictions. Cultures are constantly trying to reconcile these contradictions, and this process fuels change. For instance, in medieval Europe, the nobility believed in both Christianity and chivalry. A typical nobleman went to church in the mornings and listened as the priest held forth on the lives of the saints. Vanity of vanities, said the priest. All is vanity. Riches, lust, honor are dangerous temptations. You must rise above them and follow in Christ's footsteps. Be meek like him. Avoid violence and extravagance. And if attacked, just turn the other cheek. Returning home in a meek and pensive mood, the nobleman would change into his best silks and go to a banquet in his lord's castle. There the wine would flow like water. The minstrel sang of Lancelot and Guinevere, and the guests exchanged dirty jokes and bloody war tales. It is better to die, declared the barons, than to live with shame. If someone questions your honor, only blood can wipe out the insult. And what is better in life than to see your enemies flee before you and their pretty daughters tremble at your feet? The contradiction was never fully resolved. But as the European nobility, clergy, and commoners grappled with it, their culture changed. Now, that was a passage from the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, who is an Israeli historian. Contradictions. Contra. That means against. Looked up the root words on Google the other day, and against. Diction, I think that was something like word or phrase. So these phrases, these words, these ideas that are against one another, grinding, wrestling. And his claim that it fuels change, that's a very fascinating concept. Controversy, contradiction, these points in a culture of disagreement, whether through hypocrisy or outright disagreement, two people who have very different views of reality. And you know, for a long time I saw the intense controversies that go on today, and I thought about them as some sort of negative. But this puts an interestingly different perspective to it. Well, not exactly, right? Because sometimes the change that is fueled, it's not always positive. The example that they extend on in there, at least the first example they give, is that the Crusades were large in part a result of these contradictions in value. But there are some more positive examples, I'm sure, although I can think of none at the moment. But continuing on with the notes. A method was discovered for separating the ideas. This is a quote from a book called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. I'll start from the top again. A method was discovered for separating the ideas, which was to try, one, to see if it worked, and if it didn't, to eliminate it. This method became organized, of course, into science, and it developed so well that we are now in the scientific age. And for those of you who don't know, Mr. Feynman is a world-renowned physicist. He has won a Nobel Prize, and he's, aside from being a very strange character, known for being a lover of science. And as he goes on in this book to describe what he would call scientific integrity, a core part of the system that is science that makes it work. It is, quote, an extra type of integrity that is bending over backwards to show how you're maybe wrong, that you ought to have when acting as a scientist. And in my own words, and one must share, quote, details that could throw doubt on your interpretation must be given if you know them. Contradictions, disagreements in a culture. I would say ultimately for the purpose of achieving something better or something good. And to do that, I imagine there's some degree of trying to find truth, right? For example, with the Christian and Knight friction in values, the friction between different values. It seemed they were both trying to thrive, but they had different ways to get up the mountain, so to speak. And not only did they have different ways to get to the top of mountain being the metaphor for prosperity, but they had outright disagreements, one promoting fast pacifism, the other the joys of war and conquering. And not only did the same culture contain these disagreeing values, but I'm sure a lot of the individuals had it as well. A very strange part of humanity, of reality in general. And this, well, the reason I bring this up paired with the passages from Mr. Feynman's book are to bring up the dialogue, the diction, one might say, surrounding controversies nowadays, surrounding our disagreements, the dialogue surrounding our disagreements, the way in which we exchange information or don't exchange information in regards to these conflicts of values. And you know, as I'm saying that, it's very weird to... Let me back up for a second. I would think that these two values couldn't coexist, right? That either one has to be or the other. You're either a pacifist or you're a man who enjoys war, a person who enjoys war. And yet, the fact that they both existed within a person at the same time, makes me think of what I heard Freud's, one of his key discoveries was about humans. And this key discovery being that humans are like collections of many sub-personalities that exist within you, and many of them want different things, and sometimes they wrestle for it, sometimes they have negotiations, all within you. Many different partial personalities, we might call them. And I wonder, how necessary is it to have communication between opposing beliefs, opposing values, opposing realities, we might say? Is it important to have dialogue between the two? Is it fine if they don't really talk? What about the instances in which the two literally can't coexist? For the example of, I'll say, the Civil War in America. Some people believed slavery was a good thing to have, a thing that not only they wanted, but they were willing to fight and die for and kill for. Another part of the country believed the opposite, that slavery is not something they could let exist any longer. And there were other business-related and many other factors that played into that war, but that's the very common story that surrounds that war. That sometimes the contradictions can't coexist. And you know what's really fascinating, to go off on let's see where this little rabbit hole of a tangent goes. Although the North won, the South did not entirely lose. The North won that war, the war on paper. And then you can, of course, learn about Jim Crow laws, a lot of the hate and prejudice that went on in the South. So, though the technical, politically defined war was over, there was very much, and still is today, a war going on that contains the same essence that the war had all those years ago, the Civil War. And so we're still kind of wrestling out this race contradiction, this race controversy. And then that brings to mind Daryl Davis and the concept of peace and respect. Now, Daryl Davis, as I've said before, first off, feel free to look into his story. I highly recommend the podcast's first one with Joe Rogan. Beautiful conversation. Very interesting man. This is a black man who, when he was young, became deeply curious about how someone could hate him and his race without even knowing him, without knowing them. And so this planted the seed when he was young, and that seed grew into him eventually interviewing and at times befriending hundreds of Ku Klux Klan members over dozens of years. And through his conversations, some of the Klan members he spoke with left the Klan. Now, did they entirely leave behind all their racist beliefs? I don't know. But enough so that they left the Klan and so that they could be friends with Daryl Davis, and it's weird saying his full name, with Daryl, or because, you know, we're on a first name basis with Daryl, and perhaps improve their relationships with people of all different races in their life and their family's life, etc. But what really gets me about this story is that when Mr. Davis, would talk to people about these topics, it wasn't with the same ire and disrespect that I so commonly hear controversies discussed with nowadays, specifically in America. We've gained a bit of a reputation for that, both in our own country and worldwide, from what I've heard. That when we have a disagreement, whether it could be abortion, Ukraine, Trump, climate change, etc., 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 many of the public discussions that are held about this, especially on popular platforms, I'm thinking in particular of really any major entertainment news organization, whether a Fox, a CNN, an MSNBC, and it does seem to lean towards entertainment as opposed to trying to objectively and fairly represent to you the highest priority, the most meaningful things that are going on in the country. It doesn't seem to be that. It seems to me to be more about entertainment, largely rage-based entertainment, but that has been the popular reputation I have noticed with American controversies. And not only that, but also at the dinner table, as I'm sure some of you have experienced. I certainly have. With family and friends, that even between people so fucking close to you, it doesn't take much digging into these conversations, particularly if different views are sitting at the same table. That very quickly arguments, insults about these topics are brought up and thrown at one another. And in my experience, before a solid understanding of one another is ever established in the first place. And perhaps it is in part because people already think they know the other person's view before they've expressed it. And in my own experience, it seems that there is a caricature for sure that has existed at least, and I'm quite sure in other people's minds, but at least in my mind, I've had caricatures. And, putting that word aside for a second, I don't want to overuse it. Just having a believed understanding of the other person's view before I ever heard them express it, right? I have this box in my head of, let's say, Trump voters or people who don't believe, don't believe in climate change, right? For the longest time, and I'm to a degree, I'm quite sure that to a degree I still have this, but in those boxes, if you ever brought up a point even vaguely resembling the sentence, I don't think climate change exists or is as intense or caused by people, isn't as intense as people say, or isn't caused by people, I would just have this rest of your view already written out in my head, and I would just stamp it on your forehead without even continuing to listen to you. And maybe while you're talking, I'd already be blanking you out, and maybe even I would have some sort of rage build up, and I'm already getting worked up. My heart rate is increasing. My thoughts perhaps don't become as clear. I'm not listening to you as much, not being patient. And then this will circle back to respect. When Daryl Davis talks about speaking with Klansmen, he has emphasized the fact that it is a respectful dialogue, one, and that two, he's not going there to convince anybody. He's not going there to convince anybody. He's going there out of curiosity. Why do you believe this? And if in the process of this investigation, I hear you say information that I disagree with for whatever reason, I will relay to you my disagreement. Again, respectfully. And what does that mean exactly? Politely, you might say, kindly, in a way that the person can sense that you're not trying to harm them. That you're not doing it with the intent of having a negative outcome for them. They're actually trying to understand them. Seems something like that. And that when he mixed this wonderful combination together, well, my God, he's actually had long, fascinating conversations with Klan's leaders, by the way, like state leaders of the Klan in, different states. And that the person that he's speaking with will also listen to them. I'm sure there have been some people who just didn't listen, and he said there are some people who just refuse to ever change their mind or really dig deeply into these subjects with them. But many people do. Many people are curious about him, about his views. And if he ever provides a valid disagreement, they might bite onto it, right? I've heard another, he was either ex-Nazi or an ex-Klansman. He gave a TED talk about, his life, his journey, yada, yada, yada. And nowadays when he talks to people who are in the Klan or in Nazi organizations, he'll have this similar sort of conversation that Daryl has, and he's describing it as, it's like you're going over the road with them, their road. And if you notice a pothole, well, you can help them fill it. The pothole being an error in reasoning and logic. Assuming, of course, that Daryl Davis and this ex-Klans/Nazi men do have the right view, so to speak. The true view, perhaps. Truth. Assuming that even I have the right view. Because, I don't hold, to my knowledge, very strong or very many racist beliefs. I probably have some either culturally instilled or biologically instilled, but, I also have a deep love and respect for people from all different walks of life. If I know myself at all, it seems that way. But truth, going down this road, reasoning, a tool that humans have for discovering truth. Truth, what is that exactly? You know what? I'll leave that tangent perhaps for another time. But reality, right? The thing that is. In science, you often hear people say, like, you want to bet, right? Because that is one of the cores of science. One of the reasons it has thrived so. One of the reasons that we now live in something called the age of science. Because when it comes to tools to figuring out reality, tools to figuring out how things work, right? Betting on what will work. And how do you place that bet? You want to go with the highest probability thing. And how do you find this highly probable thing? Well, in science, you do many tests. You try in many ways, as Feynman said. You bend over backwards to try and disprove this thing, right? You hit it from every angle, trying to obliterate it with the hammer of truth. And if it is true, it remains. And then you get to have planes that fly. You get to have phones that work, medicine that works, etc., etc. A culture of bending over backwards to try and see how you're maybe wrong. A culture of, if you know some information that might poke a hole in your current belief, you don't tuck it away and never bring it up in a conversation for fear the person will grab it and use to, stab you with it like, ha, you're wrong and this is why, and bam. And that's a weird fucking thing that happens when you're going into a conversation trying to end the result being quote unquote right. Because what does it even mean to end an argument being right? Well, it means that you both end it believing that you understand reality. And very often that's not exactly what happens, because the person who loses the argument is seething and looking for like any fucking way they can poke a hole in what you said. And maybe you pin them so efficiently through argumentative techniques that at that moment they can't get out of this pin. They don't know any way to poke a hole in your argument. That doesn't necessarily mean you're right. You could do that by just holding back all the information you have that might poke a hole in it that but you don't, for whatever reason, want them to know. That you want them to think you just have this understanding of reality. Ha, fuck you. I did it. I pinned you, bitch. Right? But if science is one of the, if not the best tool for understanding reality and to thrive, right? To live a good life, it seems necessary the vast majority of the time to be in tune with reality. To know when you're hungry, when your wife is pissed at you, when someone might be trying to screw you over at work, when you, so on and so forth, right? Those are all social examples, but in any context where reality helps you achieve the good. And if our culture is one at the moment in which having a conversation with scientific integrity surrounding some of the most important fucking topics of the day, right? Because that's largely where controversies lie. Not all the time. Sometimes the most important stuff does not make it to the juiciest arguments. But if you talk about something like, for example, climate change, it's very often talked about with an apocalyptic air. Like, it could be the thing that kills us, period. Humans just... And one might think, or if we're talking about who the president should be, right? One might think, when you're discussing with your countrymen, your country people, perhaps it is better to add more gender neutral lingo into the common patois, but scrubbing that aside for a second, my hypothesis that I want to test is that if we want to arrive at the best future, then wouldn't finding out the true way to solve these problems be the best thing to do? And if science has proven to be one of the best, if not the best tool for discovering the truth, then when it comes to figuring out what to do about a controversy, about a problem, wouldn't having true scientific discourse be the best route, or at least one of the best routes? And to have scientific discourse with the integrity that Feynman speaks of, it seems, again, to bend over backwards to see how you may be wrong. And I have a long way to go with that, for sure. But I think it would help our culture if that mindset became perhaps more popular. Is there a context in which arguing like we are right now is better than having the respectful scientific debate, dialogue, right? It's not necessarily debate, because that's more confrontational, trying to prove myself right, as opposed to trying to find the truth. So dialogue. What the fuck did I just say? Is there a way in which it might be better to ragefully scream at one another? Because it struck me the other day, like, what would be the image to describe how many controversies are spoken about nowadays? And the image came to my mind of, like, all right, cup your ears, right? Like, as efficiently as you possibly can. Squeeze all the air out and just fucking, like, hold on for dear life, like, squeeze for dear life. And then, right, you just kind of look at someone, and you're doing this because you heard them say something, and we heard them say, fucking, oh, that wrong. Fucking disagree with me. I'm gonna, they gonna get it now. And then you fucking cup your ears, and you just scream your point. You just scream the truth you have in your head, the script. You just fucking, let them have it. And, oh, man, they're gonna start cupping their ears and screaming at you, and then you have to, like, get in each other's face, and eventually it just seems like the natural conclusion of that is you just kick someone in the nuts. It, like, just beat the violence seems like a very likely next step in that sequence of events. So maybe, as Yuval was talking about earlier, with contradictions, disagreements, that's, at least I kind of saw those synonymously when I read that, controversies and contradictions. If those are the things that are the spice of a culture, the thing that makes it evolve and move forwards, and change, perhaps, to adapt to the changing world. Maybe something like that. Then maybe this screaming match we're having right now as a country. I was thinking the other day that maybe it's in response to the information age, which is a way our time is currently described very often, the age of information, right? At your fingertips. We now have more information than anybody before in known fucking history. You, yes, you, right there, watching this, you have that at your fucking fingertips. And so you're sifting through all that, and perhaps within that, you're trying to find truth about, let's say, a controversy, and maybe you're just watching it because you enjoy the arguments. Sometimes it's fun. I must admit, sometimes I enjoy people like, ooh, I pwn you in an argument, bitch. It's like watching an MMA fight. So, there's some fun to that. But let's say you're searching for the truth, and there's all this different information, and then you get struck with, oh my God, it's really fucking tough to find the truth. A lot of the time, that's at least been my experience. It doesn't seem very easy to find out what the truth is. There seems to be a lot of experimenting involved, which perhaps that's why that's so commonly associated with science, right? When you're looking for truth, you're testing things, you're placing bets, right? Making the hypothesis, well, if this is true, then that must be happening, right? Then you go investigate, well, is that happening? Okay, but then you're reading it online, right? So, well, what website specifically is saying it's happening? Okay, well, is this website a credible magnifying glass, let's call it, right? And maybe you got to go check the lens, so to speak. You got to go see if there's any dirt on the magnifying glass, or maybe some weird distorted bend in the glass. That being, check the credibility of your websites. Have they been known to lie or just be bad sources of information at times? And then who are the people that are telling you that they either are or are not a credible source of information? Then there are these deep rabbit holes one can go into if you're really, really hunting for the truth. And you're comparing and you're contrasting these more information than has ever existed before at people's fingertips in known history. Who knows? Maybe Atlantis, but that's a different conversation. Yeah. And so maybe this arguing is the growing pains of our culture trying to adapt to people being so informed. Well, to people having so much data, not necessarily being informed. That's a different. When I think of that, I think more like you have credible information, like you know what you're talking about, but it's hard to figure out exactly who has that. It seems tough to define what an expert is exactly, right? Hours doing a task combined with the results you're getting. Anyway, that's a different. All right, going back to the notes for a second. Coming back to. All right, so with all these discussed topics in mind, right, to review really quickly, the perhaps necessary changing element in cultures, societies, and maybe even in ourselves as individuals, and that element being contradictions, controversies, disagreements, the wrestling of perhaps what to value of what is true, things like that. And then tools for finding truth. One of the best ones being science, scientific integrity. Scientific integrity being described as trying to bend over backwards to see how you're maybe wrong. And then I will focus both of those in. Oh, also, the culture of how we're currently discussing these things and people's tendency, and I've noticed this in myself, to buckle down on what you think is right, and perhaps even to degrade the views that disagree with that. And also a tendency to get locked into a loop of only seeing data that agrees with what you agree with. Because you could find practically infinite amounts of that. And if you lack a deep-rooted scientific integrity, trying to bend over backwards to see how you're wrong, well, perhaps you're susceptible to getting caught in the echo chamber, where all you ever hear bouncing back to you are your own beliefs. And then you get so much emotional intensity behind those, perhaps because you hear a world of information telling you that it's true. And so in the spirit of scientific integrity, I will now zoom into the controversy of climate change. Now, around my early teenage years, I remember vividly the seedling being formed within me, of the view I had on climate change. And that view being that I assume since I grew up in a left-leaning environment was obviously that climate change is man-made. It is disastrous and will be within a few decades. That essentially anybody denying this statement may be corrupted by an oil company that's afraid they'll lose profits. Oh, those greedy, dastardly corporations. Or that you were just stupid if you didn't think that that was true, right? Because, all these scientists, also that the view that the majority of scientists agree with this view. And so I start to think, why do I agree with this? Well, let's go to that. One of the previous statements. That most of the scientists seem to agree that climate change is man-made and a huge problem for mankind. Okay, well, if most scientists are saying that, it's true. And where have I heard this? I don't know, I've heard this on maybe some scattered news channels, maybe on a John Oliver skit or a Bill Maher show. And, I've seen my parents watch that, and they've been pretty intelligent throughout my life, so, I could trust them to guide me towards truth, right? Guide me towards what works, we'll say. And if the majority of scientists, like 95, 98% are saying it, according to them, according to these sources I named previously, well then, it's true. And then a few months ago, I was hit with this conflict, this inner contradiction, we'll say, in which people who I also find to be largely credible, trustworthy sources of information, specifically Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, two, interestingly enough, very hotly controversial figures nowadays, who I admit are not perfect sources of information, definitely get things wrong, and I surely have disagreements with both of them. That being said, I've listened to them for a while, listened to quite a lot of their ways of thinking, and have found them to have a respectable degree of scientific integrity. Meaning they're willing to often have people come on their shows or their podcasts specifically who have differing views on a topic. For example, on Joe Rogan's podcast, he's had people that both fall on the side of the aisle that says climate change is, we'll call it the left side for now, the rough category. It's not completely right, but the left side that says, man-made, very disastrous. He's had people, very credible people, under that category on his podcast. And he has also had people that say it is man-made, climate change. The earth is warming, but it's not disastrous. Not nearly as disastrous as we have been led to believe. Also, sorry, I made a partly incorrect statement earlier. That they have said some changes in the environment have been man-made. The earth does seem to be warming. CO2 does seem to be going up, but that is not as disastrous as we've been popularly led to believe. And that maybe a lot of the changes are naturally caused. Now, that's when that little inner contradiction, little disagreement with what I once believed popped up inside of me, right? Because here are these people who I have found to be quite trustworthy sources of information, and they have brought me new data that really disagrees with beliefs I have held for quite a while, and quite strongly too. But these people seem quite credible. They've had, high-profile positions in careers relating to climate and climate change. They, as I hear them speak, seem to have scientific integrity and to be intelligent, and that they have brought up points that either I have not heard before or that downright contradict some points I thought I knew. And so I thought, okay. Oh, and by the way, these people specifically are Steve E. Koonin, author of the book Unsettled, and Bjorn Lomborg, author of the book False Alarm. Now, continuing on, I figure if these topics are of potential apocalyptic proportion, and I don't have anything else that seems much better to do sometimes, I should investigate this. I'm curious. I'm curious what they have to say. Let's dig into this a little bit. And I have bought their books, and I've read through some of them, and I will go over some of their information today and investigate it with a little bit, I admit, of a leaning towards agreeing with their points of view. I will be pushing back at times in the spirit of scientific integrity, but perhaps out of joy or maybe a bit of laziness, something like that. I will go along with their arguments. I'll lean in that direction of agreeing with them for now. All right. Oh, quick switch up. What? Before I do that, I will say that one of the reasons also that I started to investigate. Yeah, I have a little sip of espresso. Investigate these topics and these points of view. Some good shit. Are because it seemed like the mechanism for providing me with the reality of what is going on regarding these hot topics, that the mechanism for telling me what's true with these controversies, it seems to be a bit corrupt at the moment. And by that I mean kind of breaking down, right? In my view, then I'll go back to the evidence of, in many popular circles, these conversations are being argued about rather than discussed, and straw men seem to be put against steel men as opposed to steel men against steel men. And I use that term often, and I'll elaborate on that for a second. If I create an argument, let's say, for climate change, and I'll have someone on the network who's like a top UN investigator, a steel man, very strong arguer for this point of view, and opposing him, I'll have someone who's kind of a schmuck, who's either a wacky character or believes a more ridiculous point of view, one of the more extreme ridiculous points of view in this controversy. And in the realm of climate change, I would say that would be the view of it's completely made up. It's not happening at all. This is just a lie by the man, so on and so forth. That sort of character seems to often be put up against the very steel man. And that would be the straw man, the person that the steel man can just like blow on really hard and the straw man will go flying. But I like to see steel men versus steel men, at least when it comes to trying to find reality. So anyway, it seems like the truth-finding mechanism has become broken down a little bit. And a little fun side tangent, about that for a second. I view it kind of like a car. When a car is working, you seem to categorize it essentially as the thing that gets you from point A to point B. And that maybe, plays fun music along the way. When you think car, that's what you think. The thing that gets me from here to there. That's what it is. But when it breaks down, then it becomes a fucking car, right? The incredibly deep levels of complexity that are the car kind of blow up around you, especially if you don't know a lot about cars, which is the category I fall into, right? Like, you hear some grinding on the highway and your engine, a little bit of smoke starts like coming out from the hood, and you pull over and you're like, well, fuck. Now I'm faced with this incredibly elaborate puzzle that I have no idea how to fix, and then I have to go, find an expert, someone who's an expert at traversing this maze that is the inner workings of a car, and I'll have them, solve the puzzle. That being said, it seems as though the onus is largely falling on me to become a mechanic, so to speak. Because if the thing that's broken down is the mechanism for providing me with truth, specifically surrounding a controversy, then how do you solve the truth-finding mechanism, right? Well, maybe you go to people who are really good at finding truth, the mechanics. Although, I must say, when you pair that with the incredible amount of information we now have, it seems hard to find those people. And when at least I have dug a little bit beneath the surface of specifically the climate change topic, or really any hot topic, it's very rarely cut and dry, black and white. And it can seem that way if you only listen to one point of view. But when you start to dig into the other point of view, and you're not just digging into it to create a straw man, you're digging into it to create a steel man. And when you start to do that, you begin to see that both sides of the argument tend to have strong points if you look for them. If you really try to make a strong point for both sides, it has been my experience that you often will, which then means, okay, the expert for finding truth lies on both sides of the aisle here. There are experts on both sides, but these experts disagree, but they're both really good, it seems, at finding the truth about this topic, but they disagree. And so shit, now I kind of have to be the intermediary that can bounce back and forth. And so maybe what I said isn't exactly right. Maybe there are some people who are very good at finding truth. And actually, as I say that, one person in particular comes to mind, and that would be Richard Feynman, a lover of science, someone who had pretty strong scientific integrity, it seems to me. And, oh, by the way, the book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. I mean, he's a physicist. That's what he's famous for. But he's also a really fucking wacky character. And this book leans more towards that side of him. And it's by him. Like, these are firsthand accounts of his life and stories he's telling. And sprinkled throughout that book, are very useful tools for finding out truth. Specifically, the last chapter called Cargo Cult Science. Oh, and while I'm on this topic, I should say that one of his pieces of advice... Oh, also, it's a very small book, by the way. But one of his pieces of advice is that do not fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. And that once you get good at not fooling yourself, not fooling other people becomes easy. You're the easiest person to fool. And just having that collection of words in the back of my mind put in a certain way, that wisdom, that has been very helpful, I think, in finding truth. So anywho, let's dive into this book try to find a little bit of truth. Let's see what we find. Let's start out swinging a little bit. From the book Unsettled, drawn directly from recent published research, or the latest assessments of climate science published by the U.S. government and the UN. 1. Humans have had no detectable impact on hurricanes over the past century. And I've certainly heard that hurricanes have been breaking records recently, major storms in general, and that humans have been the main contributor. All right, going back to the book, quote, Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more rapidly today than it was 80 years ago. Going out of the book for a second, and the significance of that is that it's my understanding, and apparently many scientists, that 80 years ago, humans' impact on the climate was very insignificant, that it has ramped up very quickly over the past several decades. Going back to the book. And also, I should say, full disclosure, the specific year, I forget, in which our CO2 emissions reached the point of critical mass where it would now be affecting the climate way more than it ever has before. I don't know when that started to happen exactly, but 80 years ago, apparently, was before that time. All right, going back to the book. The net economic impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal through at least the end of this century. Okay. So Greenland. That's a big one. That's one of the major ones I remember hearing, that the Greenland ice sheet is melting incredibly quickly because of humans specifically. And within the book, he lists some graphs to show Iceland's melting and re-expanding of ice, because it does so with the seasons. It has a pattern typically, just because, it gets hotter and colder at different parts of the year. And that if you were to look at a small section of this graph, let's say at a point of anomaly, and you create a graph that is only the anomaly, just to be aware that you can create a graph that makes it look like Greenland's ice sheet is melting at an incredibly fast rate. But if you then expand the time horizon on that graph so that it's now 100 years instead of, say, 10 years, well, then you see that anomalous spike in ice melting, well, there were several times well before that, decades and decades before that, where it also melted at around that rate, if not higher. So that's an important theme, the time periods of a graph. All right, going back to the notes. Let's talk about sea level. We're going to start out talking essentially about sea level and melting. All right, where is it? Slow cycles, variations in the Earth's orbit, and the tilt of its axis over tens of thousands of years change the amount of sunlight absorbed by the northern and southern hemispheres. As we've seen in Chapter 1, those changes have caused large swings in the global temperature over the past million years. But they also cause the ice sheets covering the continents to grow or melt, and in parentheses, the intervals are technically called glaciations and interglacials, respectively. Putting less or more water in the oceans, and so causing sea levels to fall or rise accordingly. So that's another common theme I hear, that sea levels have been dramatically rising due to human effects on the environment. But as he expands out the time of measurement for the sea level to, let's see, it's about 400,000 years on this graph. And on this graph, and if you want to look at these graphs, I recommend just, go to a Barnes & Nobles or a library, sit down in the coffee section, and just read over these books without ever having to buy them. This is on page 150 for those of you who might be so inclined. So anyway, on this graph, you notice several points, 4 points in particular, with about 100,000 years in between each. And these 4 points on the graph are peaks, heights of sea level. And there's about 100,000 years between each peak. And then it goes down. Maybe the environment gets a little colder, so more of the water is freezing, not going into the sea. And you can see that the current time we're living in, for the past about 50,000 years, there has been a large spike in sea level rise, but no larger than several other points in the graph, which is very fascinating to me. And, full stipulation, I have not dug very deeply into the source of this graph. So, there's always that. How deeply am I really willing to dig? As I'm sure I continue along this journey of investigation, I'll slowly go deeper and deeper. And also, global sea level since the last glacial maximum, I believe, meaning the point where, there was a maximal amount of glaciers before they started to melt again back into the ocean, meaning that the sea levels weren't very high because a lot of the water was frozen against these giant glaciers. And about 24,000 years ago, you can see it start to slowly tick up. And then at about 10,000 years ago, it starts to level off, but it's still slowly going up. And so that's not something I've heard about on CNN or an MSNBC or a Bill Maher or a John Oliver. Really a left-leaning news source that's talking about climate change. Coming back from a short break, reading a section here in the book, all of the assessment reports have plenty of text emphasizing that the rate of sea level rise in the past 2 decades is higher than the average of the 20th century. For example, the CSSR, which is, according to toolkit.climate.gov, the Climate Science Special Report, the CSSR, is designed to be an authoritative assessment of the science of climate change with a focus on the United States, to serve as the foundation for efforts to assess climate-related risks and inform decision-making about responses. So that's the CSSR. And in their executive summary, they state, quote, global mean sea level, the average sea level, has risen by about 7 to 8 inches since 1900, with about 3 of those inches occurring since 1993. So you can see a quick spike happening since 1993. Going back to the book, that statement was a red flag for me because it compares the rise over the past 20 years with that over more than a century. Compares the rise over the past 20 years with the rise over a century. The fact that 3 of the 7 inches of rise since the dawn of the 20th century occurred in the past 25 years does indeed seem alarming, but suddenly less so if you know that it also rose as much, 6 centimeters as opposed to 7 centimeters, in the 25 years between 1935 and 1960, keeping in mind that that is before humans had any large influence on the climate, specifically with CO2 emissions. The CSSR makes no mention of that at all, even though its primary reference for sea level rise describes variability like that shown in figure 8.5. The rate of rise over the most recent 25 years should be compared to that over other 25-year periods to understand just how significant the rate is. This is something I didn't quite get at first, but he elaborates. When I made that point way back in my 2014 Wall Street Journal op-ed, I was criticized roundly. And here's one criticism, for example. He, meaning Koonin, the author, claims that the rate of sea level rise now is no greater than it was early in the 20th century. But this is a conclusion one could only draw through the most shameless of cherry picking. In reality, according to the data, the sea level trend was 0.8 millimeters of rise per year from 1870 to 1924, 1.9 millimeters per year from 1925 to 1992, and 3.2 millimeters per year from 1993 to 2014, i.e., the rate has actually quadrupled since pre-industrial time. But now, this is a very important upcoming tidbit. Notice that the historical intervals cited are first 54 years, when that critiquer, that's definitely not the word for critic, critiquer. The first interval cited is 54 years from 1870 to 1924, and then 67 years from 1925 to 1992, while the most recent interval, 1993 to 2014, is 21 years. Now, this disingenuously obscures the higher rates in the 20 years from 1925 to 1945, which can be seen quite clearly in figure 8.5. Now, I will attempt to paint clearly the picture that this author is painting, because for me, I didn't quite get it first. So if there's anybody out there who doesn't quite get it, let's try to clarify what this means. If you collect the average of, in this case, the rate of sea level rise over, let's say, 100 years, and within that 100 years, there were several years where the rate of sea level rise was very drastic. And these are anomalies, right? Over the 100 years, let's say for the first 20, it's rising at, pulling numbers out of my ass, 2 inches a year, which would be a lot. 2 inches a year for the first 10 years. And then the 5 years after that, it rises 7 inches a year. Whoa, it's a ridiculous anomaly. But then after those 5 years, the rate of rise goes back to 1 inch a year. For 20 years, that happens. And then, another 5 years where it spikes, but then it levels back out, it drops back down, and the rate of rise goes back to its average. And when you find the average of that 100 years, you would add up every year's result, then divide it by the number of numbers that you are adding up, and that will kind of scrub off the top those anomalies, and you will get then the average. And although for a few years there, if you were only to create a graph of those 5 years, you would see, holy shit, fucking everyone get out of the coast, move inland. The ocean's rising at a ridiculous rate. You're not going to have a fucking house if this keeps up. But if you were to wait a few more years, the rate of sea level rise would slow down again in this example. And then it would be a slow rate of rise. And every now and then there will be an anomaly. But if you only measure the anomaly, well, you're going to have a cherry-picked data set, which will lead to an untrue conclusion. And the way you can compare the averages of the rate of rise, as he describes, is to take the same interval of time, right? Why exactly? Well, I guess I just explained why. And if the example I give, if you were to compare that 100 years to the 5 years within that, the averages would look very different. So, anywho, I hope I didn't confuse the bejesus out of y'all with that. But, one way or another, moving on. To the book, I will be jumping back and forth between books False Alarm by Bjorn Longberg and Unsettled. Now I will talk about flooding. And keep in mind, I'm reading very little of these books. All right, where are we? The United Nations has carefully estimated the total amount of flooding around the world and found that it's not clear whether it is even getting more or less frequent, much less if there is a human fingerprint involved. Looking at inland flooding, the UN scientists say there is a lack of evidence and thus low confidence regarding the sign of trend in the magnitude and or frequency of floods on a global scale. The U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program, that's a mouthful, clearly says that it cannot attribute changes in flooding to carbon dioxide, nor find detectable changes in flooding magnitude, duration, or frequency. Now I'm going to pause for a second simply to acknowledge that it's very fascinating as I read this book. I am trusting that when the author says the United Nations has carefully estimated anything, well, I didn't go and check the United Nations reports. I'm simply trusting this author, largely based on the sequence of credible, well, for me, trustworthy and credible sources that led me to this author. So it's very interesting that once you have identified someone as credible, I personally at least feel like it's unnecessary for me to even look into whether the UN actually made that report or not. Because I figured if they didn't, that would be a very glaring criticism of this book. And I guess a part of me thinks that I would get that information if someone were to find that error in this person's book. So, I didn't look up critiques of this book, and that will probably be another episode. But like I said earlier, I'm leaning towards these books' arguments for the duration of this podcast, essentially. Now, going back to the book. What's true at a global level clearly is not necessarily true locally. In some parts of the United States, such as Upper Mississippi River Valley, flooding has increased. But it has decreased in other parts of the country, such as the Northwest. So overall, the United States official climatologists have made a similar finding to that of the United Nations. They have, quote, established a significant connection of increased riverine flooding to human-induced climate change. They have not established that. Sometimes, people hold up specific examples of flooding, such as in Texas or Venice, Italy, because I've certainly heard stories of Venice is going underwater, and I've heard that of, I think, Miami too, that are, quote, that are caused, in parentheses, by climate change, without there being any scientific basis to link the event to climate change whatsoever. So to go back to what I said a second ago about not checking his statements, not checking whether the UN actually said these things. When I heard from either a vice special or from a given news network that Miami or Italy is going to be underwater in X amount of decades because of climate change, it was very interesting that I never dug deeper. That one side defined it as credible, it became irrelevant to check it. What, am I going to have to become a fucking expert in everything now? In everything, and I can't just rely on experts? So this becomes a very tricky thing when you lose trust in experts. Or perhaps that's just a part of having scientific integrity and a curiosity, right? The responsibility to dig into both sides of the argument. Now, where the hell was I? Sometimes, going back to the book, sometimes there is a scientific underpinning to link a flooding to climate change. What this typically means is that researchers have run a climate model with and without carbon dioxide emissions and found that running the climate model with carbon dioxide emissions results in more precipitation that would be consistent with the flooding experienced. But we need to stop and think harder about this. If we look at a computer model, if we look at computer models only when there's a flood, and then sometimes say, aha, we are ignoring all the places where there was no flooding. And because climate change also means less rain in some places, there could have been flooding in the absence of climate change. This is exactly what the UN tells us when it points out that overall and globally, there's no increase in flooding. Reporting only on the negative is sadly what gives us a biased understanding. Now that statement hits me when I read it. To try and keep an eye out for the absence of a thing. Which is kind of interesting. I hear people often, and I have done my fair share of this, bashing America or critiquing America. And within those critiques is rarely brought up all the negative things that aren't happening right now, because that doesn't seem to really register the same way in someone's emotional database. When you're not getting robbed, when you're not getting assaulted, when you're not going hungry, when you're not freezing in the cold, when etc., etc. When you're not knowing how to speak, you don't understand you don't understand language, you can't read. When you don't know simple math, that doesn't really, I don't really think about that. And it's so much, for some reason, more emotionally compelling when I hear about the bad things that are happening. So, anywho. What I'll read now is a collection of quotes from the book connected with some thoughts I've written down. UN scientists, quote, UN scientists emphasize that trends in flooding are strongly influenced by changes in river management. This tells us that there are far more important levers we could be looking at to reduce flooding rather than carbon cuts. Adjusting for inflation, the U.S. flooding costs have increased from $3.5 billion in 1903 to $12.8 billion in 2018. However, it's very worth noting that there are 750% more housing units to be damaged than there were in 1903. Also, the houses have become bigger and hold many more valuable items. And even with that statistic being true, the flooding costs in terms of percentage of GDP have decreased dramatically since 1903. Quote, average floods over a year cost just over 0.05% of GDP, 10 times less back in 1903. Wait. Give me 1 second. Average floods over a year cost just over 0.05% of GDP. Oh, okay. So that's the nowadays statistic, which is 10 times less than in 1903. So it's a strange thing, right? It, to a degree, though not entirely, can become a Rorschach ink blot, right? Where you can look at it and see many different things. So if I stopped simply at the, oh my God, we have to pay adjusting for inflation, have to pay $12.8 billion a year now due to flooding, whereas in 1903 it was only $3.5 billion. And if you just stop there, it's this horrifying statistic that clearly shows that there's a fucking problem, that it's getting worse, that flooding's getting worse. It seems like evidence towards that. But if you circle back to the scientific integrity point where you're bending over backwards to try and disprove what you're saying, you dig a little deeper, right? You're like, well, okay, are there any other factors that could be contributing to that increase in flooding costs aside from the floods getting worse? And then you might look at, well, are there a lot more houses nowadays, right? A lot more valuable things to be damaged in the first place that are being built in flood zones? Why, yes, there are. And when he's talking about levers that, important levers we could look at to reduce flooding, at some point in the book he describes that we need to stop building if we want to reduce that cost. It would be a more efficient way to simply inform people about the dangers of living in flooding areas more, give people business incentives to move out of there, etc., as opposed to cutting carbon, because that can end up doing much more harm than good. All right, now here's a fun one, talking about fire. Oh, that's interesting. Excuse me, darlings, I had forgotten to read this part. Going to the book, talking about floods for a second. All of which is to say that we need to think about floods differently. Globally, the incidence of flooding is not on the rise, nor is there any evidence that global warming has led to more floods. In some areas, increased rain due to global warming may eventually lead to increased flooding, and we should prepare for that scenario with sensible water management policies. However, we should not confuse the rising cost of flooding with flooding itself, or indeed with climate change. It is entirely caused by more houses and more wealth. In fact, the cost compared to the U.S. national income has declined almost tenfold. If we want to reduce this amount even more, the the solution isn't to be found in radically reducing carbon dioxide. The solution is stop building lots of big, expensive houses in flood zones. That's a bit of a sassy way to say it, but I wonder how much truth lies in that statement. All right, now going to fires. Sorry about the little diversion. There is plenty of evidence for a reduction in the level of devastation caused by fire, with satellites showing a 25% reduction globally in burned area just over the past 18 years. So 25% reduction globally. And the primary factor in the reduction in globally burned area over the past 110 years is human activity. When people started planting crops, they wanted to avoid fires and did so with fire suppression and forest management. In total, the global amount of area burned has declined more than 540,000 square miles from 100.9 million square miles in the early part of the last century to 1.4 million square miles today. So it's reduced by about 500,000 square miles of burned land. To go out of the book for a moment, he also describes earlier that people used to use fire for fuel much more, and that when we went to fossil fuels, the odds of having a fire drastically went down. People used to just heat their house with coal and, logs of wood. Not that long ago either. My grandma actually used to heat her house with coal. She'd wake up in the morning and just shovel it on in. Not that long ago. Like 10 years ago, she would still be doing that in her house. Moving on. Recently, going back to the book, scientists undertook a global simulation and found that the area burned for crops and pasture has increased globally since 1900. However, the amount of burning of undisturbed land and of land that was previously disturbed but is recovering has declined more. Overall, that has had the effect of reducing the total annual burned area by a third. None of this is to say that wildfires are not a problem. Wildfires in the United States, particularly, I'm sure you could guess, in California, get a huge amount of global attention. Government scientists undertaking an official 2018 assessment concluded that the incidence of large forest fires in the western United States and Alaska has increased since the early 1980s. Excuse me, having a little sip. Got to get them espresso grounds in the bottom of the cup. Get a little kick. All right. Blah, 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 blah. Indeed, we see an increase in area burned from the 3 million acres burned on average in the 1980s to 7 million in the 2010s in figure 4.2. However, this increase is very small compared to the annual rates of burning we saw in the early part of the last century, with 39 million acres burned on average in the 1930s. So while climate change likely is increasing the amount of land burned by wildfire, and that is something we should take seriously, it does so from a very modest level compared to historical data. And importantly, it is likely that most of the increase we're seeing now has little to do with climate and everything to do with human activities that we have much more control over. A 2017 study found that where humans are present, climate is less important in determining fire activity. It found that significant human presence, such as closeness to towns and roads, the number of people living in an area, and the amount of land developed, can, quote, override or swamp out the effects of climate. Indeed, When we look at the U.S. West, the number of homes built in high-risk fire zones, the number of homes built in high-risk fire zones has increased drastically from 500,000 in 1940 to almost 7 million in 2010. This is more than 3 times faster than the U.S.-wide housing increase over the same period. So, of course, many more homes are likely to experience wildfire. Moreover, this growth is set to continue until 2050, meaning our first target for reducing wildfire damage should be to deter people from building houses in high-risk zones. All right, going to unsettled. I don't know of any expert who disputes that the rise of CO2 concentration over the past 150 years is almost entirely due to human activities, since there are 5 independent lines of evidence supporting that conclusion. 1 is the timing of the rise. Concentrations in air samples over the past 10,000 years varied between 260 and 280 ppm before a sharp uptick began in the mid-19th century. The second is that the size of the rise is in the ballpark of what we'd expect from CO2 emitted by burning fossil fuels. A third is that the rise in the northern hemisphere leads that in the south by about 2 years. Most fossil fuels are burned in the north, which has more land and people, and that lead is increasing as emissions grow. A fourth, more subtle confirmation comes from carbon isotopes, the relatively rare carbon atoms that are about 8% heavier than ordinary carbon atoms. About 1.1% of the Earth's carbon is the isotope, C. The rest is the lighter isotope, C. Oh, sorry, that's C to the 13th power, and the rest is the lighter isotope C to the 12th power. But the proportion of C to the 12th power and C to the 13th power isn't the same in all forms of carbon. In particular, the chemical reactions of life have a very slight preference for C12, so that the carbon in living things, as opposed to mineral carbon in the Earth's crust, is light. That is, it has a slightly lesser proportion of C13. Since the carbon in the atmosphere, CO2 has become progressively lighter over the decades, we can all infer that it arises from burning fossil fuels, which, after all, were once living things. And finally, measurements over the past 3 decades have shown a tiny but detectable and steady increase in the atmosphere's oxygen concentration. The decrease is too small to raise any concern at all about our ability to breathe, but it roughly matches what's been needed to turn the fossil carbon into CO2. Now, why did I read that section? I feel like that was a testament to scientific integrity. 5 independent lines of evidence to support a claim. And so that at least showed me that this author is not a blanket denier of climate change, 1, and that for him to confirm that something is real, he understands that looking at many different factors, independent of one another, is a very effective way to find evidence for a claim. And I want someone like that, assuming that he carries that integrity towards his other scientific pursuits. I want someone like that relaying the information to me about what's going on right now with the climate. I don't want someone who sees 1 or 2 lines of evidence and immediately draws the conclusion. Maybe like 3 or 4 5 definitely independent lines of evidence. I like that. And also, as I zoom out at my younger self, and I do a quick inventory of the evidence I remember being given of the extreme nature of climate change, it was rarely given such solid evidence. And by solid, I mean from several sources that don't really have anything to do with one another. I wonder if it's a practical desire to want the popular dialogue surrounding these topics to take on an air of more scientific rigor that requires a little more deep thought and just more intensity behind confirming whether or not something is true. Anywho. Going to the book, there is no question that our emissions of greenhouse gases, in particular CO2, is exerting a warming influence on the planet. He says there's no question. Human influences on the climate have grown over the past decades and will continue to grow under all but the most radical scenarios for future emissions. Not only are human influences difficult to disentangle from other aspects of the climate system, but the relationship between emissions and atmospheric concentrations make it very challenging to moderate our influences. And he elaborated on that early in the chapter. When human influences are fed into a model to project a future climate, the results are, at some level, unremarkable. Higher greenhouse gas emissions lead to higher global temperature sooner. But knowing exactly how much warming would occur, when, and where, what other changes there might be in the climate system, and how those changes might actually impact society, requires much more sophisticated analysis. This analysis, both how it's done and what it really tells us, is the subject of the next chapter. And he goes into a chapter going over models. Because a lot of times when people say, in the next 20, if we don't cut carbon emissions by X amount in the next 10 years, we're doomed. That's a very common thing I hear. And he elaborates on where they get that information from. They'll run it through a computer model in which they'll plug into that model the amount of CO2 that exists currently, what it is projected to, how much is projected to be added into it over a certain amount of time. But you also have to add in a ridiculously large amount of factors. And perhaps I'll go over that another point, but there's this sort of lack of humility I've given science in the past, where if I heard someone say, well, we did a study, we put it through a model, many scientists agree, it is taken on this air of fact, almost unquestionable fact in my mind. But just scratching a bit below the surface, you realize how much, not infighting, but how much nuance goes in to making a statement about what a study says. Difficult shit. Going to the book False Alarm. We live in an age of fear, particularly a fear of climate change. One picture summarizes this age for me. It is of a girl holding a sign saying, "You'll die of old age. I'll die of climate change." This is the message that the media is drilling into our heads. Excuse me. Climate change is destroying our planet and threatens to kill us all. The language is of apocalypse. News outlets refer to the planet's imminent incineration, and analysts suggest that global warming could make humanity extinct in a few decades. Recently, the media has informed us that humanity has just a decade left to rescue the planet, making 2030 the deadline to save civilization. And therefore, we must radically transform every major economy to end fossil fuel use, reduce carbon emissions to zero, and establish a totally renewable basis for all economic activity. Children live in fear and line the street in protest. Activists are cordoning off cities and airports to raise awareness that the entire population of the planet is facing slaughter, death, and starvation. And this is one of the biggest problems with this issue overall, is that if people are right, the people who say that climate change, we have till 2030 to save civilization, or we are all going to starve, die in some horrific weather incident, or from heating, or from wars started from lack of resources and from all the pressures that this climate change would put on us. If that's true, then maybe a bit of panic is a useful response. And certainly if it were true, radical changes seem a reasonable response, even if it would cripple many major economies, if not completely destroy them. And even if many people would lose jobs, money, food, electricity, heating, transportation. And if transportation took a blow, then of course all the things that get transported would either jump up in price, which probably, or just not be able to be transported at all, right? And that's quite literally everything, unless you're growing things on a local farm that you can essentially walk to. But if it were to save civilization, then it's a worthwhile sacrifice, I would think. But then, of course, and that's one of the reasons perhaps that I've given these books a due diligence. Well, I've given these books some serious thought, is that if we make radical changes for a false alarm, if we make radical changes, but we're wrong, then we could very well doom humanity in another way. I mean, to think of cutting off fossil fuel use entirely, reducing CO2 emissions to zero, so no fossil fuel use, period. That's world changing in a way that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. That could be a trigger for world wars. And then we've just brought about the apocalypse because of a misunderstanding. So, at the very least, I think these arguments should definitely be given consideration. Truly. Quotes from the book to emphasize the point that there's an air of panic to climate change. The New York Times warns that, quote, Across the globe, climate change is happening faster than scientists predicted. A cover of Time magazine tells us to, quote, be worried, be very worried. The Guardian has updated its style guideline so that reporters must now use the terms climate emergency, climate crisis, or climate breakdown. Going to the book Unsettled. I first met Michael Greenstone during my time in the Obama administration, when he was leading an interagency effort to determine the economic impact of greenhouse gas emissions. Our paths have crossed a few times since. Greenstone is now the director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, and I found him to be an astute and careful energy economist. In 2019, Michael testified to Congress about some of the findings of his ongoing research into the economic efforts of local and global changes in climate. The increase in the global mortality rate due to climate change-induced temperature changes in the year 2100, is larger than the current mortality rate due to all infectious diseases. We estimate the full mortality risk due to climate change to be an additional 85 deaths per 100,000 in 2100. Fast forwarding in the book. As the research paper, but not the coverage of Greenstone's testimony, acknowledges, the analysis is fraught with assumptions and uncertainties. In fact, the author note that our full set of estimates reveals a remarkable degree of uncertainty, and that's a quote from the author, at least some of which is, another quote from the author, fundamentally unresolvable. Now, trying to keep up some scientific integrity on my end, he does not specify, and maybe it simply wasn't specified in the report, what exactly in their research has a remarkable degree of uncertainty and what is fundamentally unresolvable. Actually, sorry, he might be about to describe the uncertainty, but the fundamentally unresolvable portion, I don't think he specifies exactly what. Anyway, even apart from the economic and demographic decisions, as we've seen in Chapter 4, there are great uncertainties in both the temperature changes the models project and in the emissions scenarios used to drive them. It turns out that 85 deaths per 100,000 in 2100, quoted with great confidence in Greenstone's 2019 testimony, is actually the average value under the implausibly high emission scenario known as RCP 8.5, with an 80% probability of the value lying between negative 21 and 201. Meaning, in case that wasn't clear because it took me a little while to grasp this, that when he said in his testimony that 85 deaths per 100,000 would be, give me one moment. What he said would be an additional 85 deaths per 100,000. There was an 80% chance, by his own study, an 80% chance that said that the true value, the true number, whereas he said it was 85 increased deaths per 100,000, that the true number could lie between negative 21, so actually less deaths, or 201. There's an 80% chance that the number lied somewhere between negative 21 and 201. Going back to the book. So Greenstone begins his testimony by taking an unrealistic, extreme scenario as his starting point. According to his own model, Under the far more plausible RCP 4.5 scenario, the average death rate shrinks sixfold, from 85 to 14, with a very wide probable range between -45 and 63. So there's incredible amounts of uncertainty to these measurements. In other words, under that mid-range scenario, there's a good chance that deaths would actually decrease. And maybe he elaborated at some point in the book on why exactly the RCP 4.5 scenario was plausible and the RCP 8.5 wasn't. But yeah, I don't seem to have taken note of that if he did write it down. Going back to the book. There are other reasons not to place much confidence in these results. A crucial measure of a model's credibility is its ability to reproduce the past. A model's ability to reproduce the past. That is, if the model were run using only the data we had as of, say, 1980, how well would its projections match the number of deaths that actually took place in the subsequent 40 years? Such hindcasting, as it is known instead of forecasting, is an important test of the climate models themselves. But that basic check is absent from Greenstone's analysis. Without it, the results require an even greater helping of salt than the climate model projections they're built upon. Creating alarming headlines through highly uncertain projections of the future is one thing, but promoting the specter of climate-related deaths by distorting existing data is quite another. And it is really interesting for me to note that previously he cited Greenstone, the man who gave that testimony, as someone who is a very solid scientist. And that brings up a little more evidence to show that quite a few people are in a very genuine panic about this topic. In the United States, this is a quote from False Alarm, in the United States and United Kingdom, two of the most prosperous countries on the planet, an astonishing 65% of people are pessimistic about the future. And, another quote from the book, a 2019 poll found that almost half of the world's population, god damn, that's a big poll, believes climate change will likely end the human race. In the United States, 4 of 10 people believe global warming will lead to mankind's extinction. Now, reading directly from the book for a moment. If adults are worried silly, the children are terrified. A 2019 Washington Post survey showed that of American children ages 13 to 17, 57% feel afraid about climate change, 52% feel angry, and 42% feel guilty. A 2012 academic study of children ages 10 to 12 from 3 schools in Denver found that 82% expressed fear, sadness, and anger when discussing their feelings about the environment, and a majority of children shared apocalyptic views about the future of the planet. It is telling that for 70% of the children, television, news, and movies were central to forming their terrified views. 10-year-old Miguel says about the future, there won't be as many countries anymore because of global warming. Because I hear on like the Discovery Channel and Science Channel, like in 3 years the world might flood, and the world might flood from the heat getting too much. And all I can think about when I read that is myself being introduced to this topic with a combination of Movies like Books of Eli, Waterworld, Mad Max. And even with more ridiculous things like I Am Legend and Walking Dead, there's been a real attraction to post-apocalyptic views of the future. But, I'll get back to that in a second. First, reading another section of the book. We are being told that we must do everything right away. Conventional wisdom, repeated ad nauseum in the media, is that we have only until 2030 to solve the problem of climate change. This is what the science tells us. But this is not what the science tells us. It's what politics tells us. This deadline came from politicians asking scientists a very specific and hypothetical question. Basically, what will it take to keep climate change below an almost impossible target? Not surprisingly, the scientists responded that doing